All right. Let's move on. Let's talk to Kevan in Florida.
All right.
Pull him up. Kevan.
Hello?
Hello. You're live with Eric and V.
This is amazing.
Yay.
Hello.
What did you want to talk about today?
Well, before I get into it, what I told the screener, I would like to say that 2 years ago, my wife and I were in Austin, and I wanted to pay a pilgrimage to the atheist house on Koenig Lane.
Oh, yeah.
And
I was back there then, wasn't I? About 2 years ago, yeah.
Well, the only person it was in an afternoon. It was like a Thursday or a Wednesday afternoon, and the only person that was there was Mark the engineer. I told him I recognized him from, and he sold me a bookmark. I wanted to have some kind of a souvenir from the place, and I took pictures of the walls and everything. So I just wanted to let you guys know that I was there. I wanted to tell somebody.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Well, we're glad you got to go.
Yeah.
What can we help you with today?
Well, I've been listening to these shows for many years, and I know that the topic of slavery comes up a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And you guys speak about it all the time, and Matt Dillahunty speaks about it all the time. And you always talk about how, well, in the book of Exodus, there are a lot of things that actually condone slavery and the rules for condoning slavery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think to myself, and I go out bike riding after I listen to these shows, and I get these ideas, and I pound them into my head, and then I'm ready to talk about them. An idea that I always thought about is the fact that in the book of Exodus, it starts off where God decides he doesn't want the Hebrews to be slaves anymore. He hires Moses to go talk to the Pharaoh. And you know, there's a lot of immoral things that go on in that story leading up to the Exodus itself that, you know, that's a whole nother story. You know, killing the firstborn of innocent people in order to achieve that. But then they leave. I'm sorry. Were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. We just want to make sure that we're having a discussion back and forth. What in the Old Testament did you want to ask about?
Well, the point I wanted to make is this, that the story is there's an Exodus. They go to Mount Sinai. The whole story so far has been about getting out of slavery. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai.
I mean, we
comes down.
Kevan, we got the story. What did you want to ask about it?
Well, why is it that the first commandment in the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not have slaves, thou shalt not deal in slaves.
Got it. Kevan.
Thou shalt not countenance slavery to begin with.
Yeah. So you have to recognize that is not the first story in the Bible. It's not the first story. Did you say in Exodus or in Genesis?
No, in Exodus. No, I didn't say it was the first story in the Bible.
I'm sorry, I thought you were saying Genesis.
One of the most important parts of the Bible.
Actually, V, you've got some insight on that if you wanted to.
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I can come up with something for sure.
Okay. Okay.
Where are you going with it?
I was going with it that the Exodus has a lot less to do with what one ought to do when it comes to, you know, enslaved peoples, and it has everything to do with the story that early Israelites told themselves about themselves. You had this growing population in Canaan at the time who had, you know, who needed to build this identity. And there's a lot of kind of scholarly debate about whether or not a group came up out of Egypt. But the fact is, even if a group did, it was way smaller than depicted. And a lot of the people in that area were from that area. You know, the Israelites, from what we've seen, if you look at, Finkelstein, I think is his last name, that the Israelites came primarily from Canaan. But the idea of being God's chosen people, of being, you know, subjected to and you know, victims of all of this, you know, persecution and all of that, it's more about their own self-story, and it doesn't really make sense. If you look back at the time, the area that they would have traveled to was still a vassal of Egypt. They would have fled Egypt to Egypt. It we're looking at it through a modern context. And I think that what we're bringing to it is, how should we treat other people? What would a God want? But I think that we need to remember the context, and the context there is it's the story they told about themselves. It became the basis of a identity.
Yeah. So I love that. I love that, like, right now, a lot of Christians are like, oh, what should we get out of this story? We should get out of the story things that apply to us today. But the way that Jewish people, I believe, and also at the time this story was used, it was just a story about their history, about how they became a nation. And also, though, like, even if we were to say this has some kind of moral authority over our lives today, what we're seeing essentially is what we see here all the time. I deserve rights. You don't deserve rights. We can there is every single group we could point to could be like, okay, well, you got out of slavery and now you want slaves. Well, yeah, because it's us. And we didn't deserve to be slaves, but those people do, right? It's just human nature to be like, hey, I understand my perspective, and I understand that I'm a human who deserves these things. But it really takes a lot of additional work, both emotionally and intellectually, to be able to be like, oh, you also are a person who wouldn't like this, and so I shouldn't do that, right? The golden rule, I guess.
Absolutely. The one thing that we can take comfort in is the atrocities that are laid out in Exodus. You can at least be comforted in knowing that it didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, I was just kind of looking at it as a moral story, and it just seems to me that a moral story that's about ending slavery for a group of people should not then, because Exodus is the story of the Exodus from Egypt, but it's also the story within the story wherein the Ten Commandments happens. I believe that's part of Exodus, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Moses goes up on the mount, and you've got absolutely. I really do think, though, that in the context of why it's there, it's a lot less interesting. But I do want to say that you are on a really good point, that if anything, it is showing how immoral that system is. But I would just recognize with a little bit of understanding that it wasn't meant to be a morality story. It was meant to be a national identity.
But
story.
I see that. Yeah.
This is so interesting, though, Kevin, because I think we're getting into right here a reason why a lot of atheists and a lot of Christians can't communicate well. Because, Kevin, I think what you're the goal of this call, if I'm understanding correctly, is you're putting yourself in the mind of a Christian who might be defending certain things about Exodus, and you're trying to think about ways in that context to refute that or like address that and be like, hey, you see this as a moral text, and you see this as like slavery is bad. So how do you reconcile the fact that one of the first things the Israelites did when they got out of slavery was get slaves? Like that's a really good conversation to have with a theist. And I think that by itself is worth talking about. And it's interesting because a lot of the time we've actually done a lot of digging and a lot of research, and we're like, oh, I know the answer to this. Actually, it's all a lie, which is an entirely different conversation. So when you're having a conversation with a theist who is looking at Exodus as a moral text and moral guidance, that is a really good point to bring up, Kevin. It just is also worth knowing for yourself, and if the conversation moves in other directions, that there are problems with even viewing Exodus as a moral text in the first place.
Thank you, V. That was very well laid out. Yes to all of those things.
Thank you so much for calling in, Kevin.
Thank you for taking my call. I really appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Take care. You just summed that up super well.
I've been on panels. I can bullshit for 30 seconds and just it'll sound good.
I mean, fair. It did come to mind though. It's Israel Finkelstein. If you want to look into his books, it's an awesome debate and it's an awesome discussion. I've been doing a lot of work with Holy Kool-Aid on that studying, so it's just fresh in my mind.
Oh my gosh. Also, just FYI, there's been a fun conversation happening in the chat. And I like it because people are like, oh, well, they're not reading the chat. They wouldn't know what's being said. And yeah, we do. We know. We get it. We see you. And thank you, everybody, for being awesome about correcting pronouns and everything. It's actually okay on this show to talk about appearances a little bit. Like, we're not holding that firm line. I think that some of the other shows do, just because as long as you're being somewhat respectful, they're kind of fun and funny.
Or if you're creative. If you are creative, I hold dear to my heart some of the most hilarious.
Small Boy and the Greasy Weasel.
Small Boy and the Greasy Weasel.
Like, we would not want to miss that. So, like, if you're going to come and be creative about it, go for it. Just, don't misgender people. And be nice to the mods because they deserve respect.
Yeah.